Ukraine is at a crossroads between distancing itself from the Kremlin and trying to herald political stability. For a closer look, I'm joined by James Jatras. He is the Deputy Director of the American Institute in Ukraine. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
I want to get your reaction to Yatsenyuk's resignation that just happened the day before. How does that change what's happening in Kiev and then outside to other parts of the region?
I think it just feeds the growing sense of disarray in Kiev and the breakdown of the political order in Ukraine. His statement before the Rada, the parliament, was very stark about having no money to pay the troops, no money to buy rifles. I think this just shows more uncertainty and instability in the country.
And of course, you know, Ukraine is hoping to get more money from the EU. Let's turn to Russia moving troops. The United States is coming out and saying it has proof that Russia is moving troops and weapons to the border. Are they telling the truth?
Well, I'm sure the Russians are moving troops on their side of the border. In terms of cross-border firings or accusations of firings, you know, who's telling the truth or maybe part of the truth and who's telling lies, it's hard to tell sometimes. I think the underlying reality here is the fact that we still have what amounts to a civil war in the eastern part of the country, that there are, for example, there was a report from Human Rights Watch yesterday about multiple rocket launchers being used against civilian areas in the east, the potential war crimes issues there. This is only getting worse, I'm afraid to say.
Now, what happens with the elections taking place in Ukraine just a short time from now?
Well, a short time, we're talking about maybe in October, so we could have an extended period of instability here.
Let's turn to the sanctions that the EU has imposed on Russia. They've added a couple more sanctions, economic sanctions. Does it do anything? Is it worth Russia responding? And if Russia does, how would they respond?
I don't think anybody knows, and I don't know if these sanctions will be enough for them to respond. I think this is evidence, unfortunately, really not so much about the Europeans, but about Washington sticking to Plan A, which is try to convince the Europeans to put enough punishment on the Russians so we can force them to back down and Ukraine can secure a military victory over the East. I think that's a very bad plan. You know, when President Obama spoke the other day, he called for a ceasefire in Gaza. He didn't call for one in Ukraine. Why not? Berlin and Paris certainly would have welcomed that. Instead, what we see coming from Washington is Plan A, just support this military offensive, let them crush the Easterners militarily, and hope that this does not lead to a wider war. I think this is playing with fire. This is extremely dangerous. I think what we need is for people to take a step back. Let's have a negotiation that includes the Europeans, the Russians especially, with the Americans providing a supportive role. Let's try to have some kind of civil peace in the country instead of trying to secure a military victory.
Because you mentioned disarray and instability in Ukraine. How does the international community know who to deal with at this point? Who do they get behind?
Well, exactly. And again, back to the question of Ukraine's being bankrupt. Who do you give the money to? How are they going to spend it? How can they, who's going to bail them out? Certainly not the Europeans, certainly not the Americans, unless you bring the Russians back in and come up with an agreement about how to put this country Humpty Dumpty back together again. I don't think anything good's going to happen.
All right, James Jatras, we appreciate your time.
Thank you
so much.